Welcome back to another episode of Truth and Fertility. Today we are going to be talking about your period. There are so many women that I work with at the clinic who are coming there for the sake of maybe they have an irregular period, or maybe they're having painful periods. They're having something going on with their bleeding that's unusual. It's not normal, and that's a sign that there's something going on with her reproductive system, with her fertility. So it's really important to iron out, okay, what is even a true period? Because I feel like anytime we have any bleeding at all, we just call it a period. Like, we just assume that it's a period. We call it a period, and that's that. But in all honesty, not all bleeding that you're experiencing may be a period. So I want to iron that out for you guys today. I'm going to give you 3 rules to remember when it comes to your period or any bleeding that you're experiencing. 3 rules to remember to help you understand, okay, is this a true period, first of all, and is this a normal period, second of all? So we want to be able to iron those things out to make sure that you are as healthy as you possibly can be with your reproductive system and your fertility, because it's so important to make sure that your reproductive system, your fertility is healthy, no matter what stage of life that you're in, no matter whether you're trying to have a baby or not. You should have a healthy reproductive system. All other systems in your body are just as important. Your reproductive system should not be put on the back burner, even if you're not trying to get pregnant right now. So we want to make sure that you are as healthy as possible. So remembering these 3 rules for your period is super important to know, okay, maybe I do need to go see a doctor for this and get this fixed, get this figured out, get this healed. If I'm saying these 3 rules and you're like, that kind of sounds like me, right? So without further ado, let's get into those 3 rules today. Welcome to the Truth and Fertility Podcast. My name is Haley and I am your host. I work at an OBGYN clinic where I teach women and couples how to chart their cycles so they can either achieve or avoid pregnancy, and also to manage their fertility. I have a huge passion to teach women and couples about the beauty of their fertility and how the pill is never the answer to women's health. There's a lot of good and not so good information out there about fertility. And so my goal with this podcast is to help you sort out the truth from the weeds. I want to teach you how to chart your cycle and to reach your family planning goals, while also maybe even possibly locating hormonal imbalances and to receive proper treatment. I want to help you get in the best hands that you can with the best doctors that you can to reach optimal reproductive health. So if you're ready to get on this journey with me to learn more about your reproductive system, how it was created and how it should be working, and the best medicine in order to make it work if it's not, then you are in the right place. The first rule is that you cannot, quote unquote, skip a period. I hear this all the time. So many women are like, oh, I skipped my period this month. Or, it's just this idea that we can skip a period. That's actually false. It is not true. We cannot skip a period. So let me kind of take a bird's eye view really quick of the whole cycle, the whole menstrual cycle, to really help us dive in and understand why you can't actually skip a period. So when we're looking at the menstrual cycle, I like to separate it into 2 different phases. So we have the pre-ovulatory phase and the post-ovulatory phase. You might even hear this as the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So the reason it's called pre-ovulatory and post-ovulatory is because those 2 phases hinge on ovulation. As important as our period is, ovulation is the main event of our cycle, which is why with these 2 phases, we literally hinge them on ovulation. That's how important this event is. And for those of you that don't know, ovulation is when an egg is released from our ovary. It happens once every cycle, and it's incredibly important that your body is ovulating in a regular pattern. So there's a few important things to remember with these 2 phases. So the first phase, being the pre-ovulatory phase, starts from day 1 of your cycle. So day 1 of your period, and it ends right after ovulation. So the day of ovulation is the last day of that pre-ovulation phase. The post-ovulation phase is going to be from the day after ovulation through the remainder of your cycle. Okay, so with that being said, let's talk about the length of these phases. So the pre-ovulatory phase is going to be a lot more variable in length than the post-ovulatory phase. For most women out there, the post-ovulatory phase is very stable. Even if you have incredibly irregular cycles, the post-ovulatory phase is very stable. For the most part, after you ovulate, you're going to have about 2 weeks, give or take, about 2 weeks until you have your next period. And this is really good news for women that are charting their cycles and may have long cycles or irregular cycles, because when they can pinpoint when they ovulated, finally they'll know, okay, about 2 more weeks and then I'll have my next period. So they can actually still predict when their period is coming. Now, the pre-ovulatory phase is much more variable. So for those women that have long cycles, that have irregular cycles, it's the pre-ovulatory phase. It's going to be a lot more longer or shorter depending on when her body is finally able to ovulate. So a lot of times when women think that they skip a period, it is because for whatever reason, they are having a longer pre-ovulatory phase. It's just taking their body longer to ovulate that cycle. Now, the main culprit for this, I will say, is stress. So stress is a very natural way that our bodies recognize. It's kind of like a self-protective mechanism, honestly, where our bodies feel that stress and they say, okay, it's probably not a good time to get pregnant right now because of whatever stress is going on. So the body suppresses ovulation and continues to suppress it until that stress is relieved. And so oftentimes women will say, I skipped my period, but it's really just that her body took longer to ovulate. So that pre-ovulatory phase was lengthened out a lot more than it normally would be. And again, main culprit for that is stress, but it also could be when she has irregular cycles, maybe she has PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. I have a whole other podcast about that too. Maybe she has some sort of other reproductive disorder that's causing those irregular cycles. So it's not always stress. It could be other things going on within the body. But rule number 1 is that you cannot skip a period. So if you feel like you've skipped a period, it's probably just because you have actually had an elongated pre-ovulatory phase. Now, another rule of thumb too, this isn't necessarily going to number 2 yet, it's kind of like a 1.5 here, is that a true period must follow ovulation. So kind of going back to what I said earlier about some women will call any bleeding that they have a period, and that's not always the case, right? Some women will say, I'm having a period every 2 weeks. Okay, let's take a look at that. I to be quite honest, I kind of doubt that you're having a true period every 2 weeks, meaning that you're having a period follow ovulation every 2 weeks. That's usually not the case. That's not usually the way that our reproductive system works. And so we need to look at, okay, what is that bleeding actually? Maybe it's ovulatory bleeding. Some women actually do have some spotting around the time of ovulation, which is pretty typical. I see that, and not all women have that, but I have seen that quite often with my clients. And that's a really fertile sign, right? Because if you're around the time of ovulation, that means that you're around the time when an egg is released, and that could possibly result in pregnancy. So those types of signs are really fertile. And then there's just like unusual, unknown bleeding based on a chart alone. Sometimes the bleeding, there's not really true rhyme or reason just looking at it point blank. And that's where, we have to actually, okay, I'll send you to a doctor, and we need to do some blood work and maybe an ultrasound and actually get to the bottom of what is causing that frequent bleeding. So it's kind of a twofold, where some women say they skip a period, where other women say, I have a period every 2 weeks. Okay, well, first of all, remember that a true period must follow ovulation. So it's not the case that you are ovulating every 2 weeks. That's just not what's going on. And remembering that you can't actually skip a period. So it's going to be that pre-ovulatory phase that's more elongated when your period is late and you're not pregnant. Okay, that is number 1. Let's head to number two. So number two goes over really the pattern of what your bleeding looks like. So with a true and normal regular period, what we want to see is we call it a crescendo decrescendo. So what does that mean? It means that your period, there's basically two different patterns that we would like to see. The first one is that your period starts by being really heavy. Just day one, we start very heavy. You're changing pads multiple times a day, and yeah, you're on your heaviest day of your period. And then as the days move on, it starts to get lighter and lighter and lighter until it tapers off about a week later. Now, so that's kind of the crescendo decrescendo. And so then we have the other type or pattern of period that is also regular and fine, which is the period starting a little bit light for the first day or two, and then it moves later into that heavy time for a few days, and then goes back down and tapers off. So it's either starting really heavy and then tapering off, or it starts light, then gets heavy, then tapers off again. Those are the two main healthy patterns of bleeding that we want to see for a true period. Now, if you are having bleeding where you're having some spotting, then you have some heavy days, then you have light days again, or maybe you stop bleeding and then the day after you start bleeding again. It's kind of like this up and down, left and right type thing. Like there's really no rhyme or reason to the type of bleeding that you're having, where it's just coming and going, coming and going. And maybe your bleeding is really elongated. Maybe you're having bleeding for we usually say if it's 8 or more days, that's when we want to take a look at, that's just too long. That's too long of bleeding. We want to take a look and see what's going on there. So if your bleeding is lasting too long, or it's going up and down, right? Those are odd patterns. Those are unusual patterns, and those really need to be looked at because they're a sign that something is not healthy. So number two, having that crescendo decrescendo pattern where it's going up and then back down, or it's just starting up and then going back down. And that takes me to number three, which is the type of spotting and the type of the color of the bleeding. Those two things are incredibly important in understanding how your hormones are balancing and if they are truly balanced in the way that they should be. So the basic rule of thumb with spotting, first of all, let's talk about that first. The basic rule of thumb with spotting is if you have 3 or more days of spotting in the beginning of your period before you start that first day of bright red blood flow, meaning the first day of like a moderate or a heavy flow, that can actually be a sign of low progesterone. And I'll tell you the reason why. So progesterone, I have plenty of other podcast episodes, I'll put them in the show notes below, that really describe the role of progesterone, the role of those of estrogen and progesterone throughout the cycle. They're incredibly important for regulating the cycle, but progesterone is going to be dominant in that post-ovulation phase of the cycle, that really stable phase. And so with that being said, progesterone's job, or one of progesterone's jobs, is to keep your uterine lining intact. And your uterine lining is the bleeding that you see when you have a period. So the uterine lining is a bunch of blood cells, right? And so when you have a period, that progesterone is dropping, that causes your period, and it's the shedding of those blood cells, and that's the bleeding that you see. So when progesterone is too low, what happens is it starts to prematurely kind of break the capillaries of that uterine lining. The uterine lining should stay intact for about 2 weeks until the first true day of your period. But if progesterone is too low or it's dropping too soon, it can cause this premature spotting before the first true day of your period. So again, rule of thumb is that if you're having 3 or more days of spotting before your first day of bright red blood flow, which would be the first true day of your period, that can indicate possible low progesterone. And so we'd want to do some testing and see, what's going on there. We want to look at blood work and see, is your progesterone actually dropping too soon? Because that can also lead into a plethora of other issues, one of them being PMS symptoms. That can also be a huge sign of low progesterone, which is a whole topic for a whole other day. But another sign of low progesterone when it comes to spotting is if you're having what we call tail end brown bleeding. And this is also where we get into the color of the bleeding. That's also very, very important. So if you are having brown spotting at the end of your cycle, one day it's pretty typical. It's just old blood, right? That's coming out. But a rule of thumb for this at the end of your period is that if you are having 2 or more days of brown spotting, of that tail end brown bleeding, of brown spotting, that can also be sign of low progesterone. So taking into consideration the spotting at the beginning of your period and at the end of your period is very important, because it could be your body's language and a way of telling you that something isn't right. I mean, all of these things, the pattern of your bleeding, how often you're bleeding, these are all ways that our body is communicating to us what our hormones are doing, which is why charting your cycle is so helpful, because even just by charting bleeding alone, you can see what your body is doing or isn't doing properly, right? Based on, again, the pattern of bleeding, the type of bleeding, the color of bleeding, the heaviness of bleeding. So with that being said, just charting the bleeding alone can be incredibly helpful. And then when you add in charting other things like cervical mucus or maybe even your temperature, there's other signs that your body can give throughout your cycle to really help you hone in on what is going on with your hormones, because all of these signs are dictated by hormones in your body. So without getting too much on my soapbox there, because if I get on, I will not be able to get off. These are the 3 main rules that I want you to remember with your period. So again, the first rule is that you cannot skip a period. A true period is one that follows ovulation. So if you feel like you've skipped a period, most likely it's because you just have not yet ovulated. So you're just having one long cycle. Now, number 2, again, is the pattern of bleeding. And so it's that crescendo, decrescendo, or that going up and then going down, getting heavier and then getting lighter, not going up and down and up and down and up and down, going crazy, right? Number 3 is taking a look at the spotting that you're having. If there's 3 or more days of spotting in the beginning or 2 or more days of spotting at the end of your period, and also with the brown bleeding accompanying that, then that can be sign of low progesterone and something that you would want to take a look at with a doctor. And that is what I have for you guys today, those 3 main rules to remember. Now, if any of this sounds like you, where you're like, well, yeah, my period is not, it's not touching those 3 rules, right? There's something going on with it. Well, I highly recommend seeking out help with that, because again, that is your body telling you that there could be something hormonally off, some sort of hormonal imbalance going on. And now, with this being said, it's really hard to find a doctor that is going, in all honesty, it's going to be really hard to find a doctor that's going to take you seriously with this stuff, because this isn't something that's necessarily taught in mainstream medical school. This is more stuff that's taught in the more natural fertility world. And they're just things that we are learning. We're always learning more and more about the woman's body and the signs that the woman's body gives that can actually be indicative of these hormonal imbalances or reproductive disorders. So if you're having trouble finding a good doctor, a doctor that's going to take you seriously, a doctor that's going to encourage you to chart your cycle and actually use that chart for the sake of medicine, all of those good things, I highly recommend going to FertilityCare.org. That is a website where you can find, first of all, you can find women, or men and women, I guess, that can teach you how to chart your cycle. I am also included in that. If you would like to go to truthandfertility.com, you can find me there as well, if you want to learn how to chart your cycle. But on top of that, there are also a list of doctors on that website that know how to read cycle charts, that are not going to put you on the pill, that are actually going to try to get down to the root cause of what is causing this weird bleeding that you're experiencing. So that's FertilityCare.org, just shameless plug. Also for my own website, truthandfertility.com. And the other place that I do recommend going to is a website called Facts About Fertility. That's Facts, F-A-C-T-S, About Fertility. And that is an organization that actually, its whole mission is to teach med students and doctors about fertility awareness-based methods, about charting the cycle for the sake of medicine. It is an amazing organization. Highly, highly recommend going to check them out. And I believe they do have a directory on their website that also has doctors who work in this area and who are very knowledgeable in this area. So if you are struggling to find a really good doctor that's going to take you seriously with this stuff and actually get to the root cause of what is going on here without just slapping the pill on you, highly recommend all of those websites. I will put them in the show notes below. Thank you so much for sticking around with me today, and I will talk to you guys again next week. Thank you for listening to the Truth and Fertility podcast. If you are enjoying this content, it would be amazing if you could leave a 5-star review. That helps me tremendously to be able to continue to produce these episodes for you. Remember that these podcasts are available on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon, and YouTube. And you can always go to my website, truthandfertility.com, to learn more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you again next week.